Did you know that some people absorb too much iron from their diet, and iron-rich foods as well as supplements can be unhealthy for them? In this video I'll explain why and what role your genes play in this. Iron as a dietary component is a good example of how a certain nutrient can be important for one person and harmful for another. To understand this, we first need to take a brief look into our evolutionary past. 20,000 years ago, we humans were hunters and gatherers. We had long since eradicated mammoths and we were hunting with bow and arrow for anything we could catch. Observations from indigenous peoples who still live as hunters and gatherers today show that back then about 65% of daily calories came from animal food. Animal food contains a lot of iron, so our diet 20,000 years ago was rich in this essential micronutrient. Back then, our genes were optimally adapted to this diet, and the HFE gene controlled the precise iron absorption into the body. It formed channels in the intestine that absorbed about 10% of the contained iron into the bloodstream. The body's primary use for iron is to form blood, which is responsible for carrying oxygen throughout the body. About 10,000 years ago, when we set aside our bows and arrows and began farming, our diet changed fundamentally. We gradually ate more and more grain products and less meat, suddenly obtaining only 35% of our daily calories from iron-rich animal food. However, the HFE genes did not know about this change and continued to absorb only 10% of the small amounts of iron from the diet. Iron deficiency began to spread among the population. This was problematic. The deficiency reduced fertility, making it harder for people to reproduce. Even with significant blood loss in bloody battles and during childbirth, iron deficiency led to worse survival chances. The deficiency thus became a genuine health problem. And then human evolution happened. About 6,000 years ago, in the region of present-day Ireland, a gene defect emerged that changed the HFE gene. It did not destroy the gene's function, as most gene defects do, but surprisingly made it even more active. Suddenly, carriers of this new gene defect no longer absorb just the usual 10% of iron, but a whole 20% of dietary iron into their bodies. So while the iron in our diet halved, this gene defect doubled the absorption and we were back to normal. The HFE gene had adapted to the new conditions and ensured sufficient iron supply through increased absorption. After this gene defect spread among the British population, the then Celtic people began invading and expanding throughout European countries. With them, they spread the gene for ginger hair and their new ability to absorb enough minerals from an iron-poor diet. It made them more fertile and resilient to war injuries, spreading the new HFE gene throughout Europe. Today, most of us have left the farming life behind, and a visit to the supermarket is enough to stock a variety of different foods in our fridge. Our consumption of animal foods has increased again. However, suddenly this new ability to absorb a lot of iron from food becomes a problem. If a person inherits this new Celtic variant of the HFE gene from both parents and regularly eats iron-rich foods, too much iron enters the body. The body has difficulty getting rid of this excess iron, and this unfavorable iron overload is also called curse of the Celts today. How much iron is absorbed through food depends largely on whether one has inherited Stone Age or the new Celtic variant of the HFE genes. Now let's take a look at the genes. Iron-rich food is eaten and enters the intestine. Now it's the HFE gene's turn. It produces the channels that spread along the intestinal wall and absorb a certain amount of iron into the bloodstream. However, only a small part of the iron is needed and absorbed, and so the remaining iron passes through the intestine and eventually ends up in the toilet. In this case, the Stone Age HFE genes have absorbed exactly the right amount of iron and the person is optimally supplied. However, if a person has inherited several of the new Celtic HFE genes, the situation is quite different. The same amount of iron enters the intestine, but this time the Celtic HFE genes are much too active. They produce far too many channels and absorb too much of the iron into the bloodstream. For these people, an iron-rich diet and supplements with iron can be very unhealthy. Therefore, these people should pay particular attention to a balanced diet with sufficient fruit and vegetables and avoid iron-containing foods and especially iron-containing dietary supplements.